Welcome to the Uniting America podcast, presented to you by braverangels. I'm braverangels National Ambassador and your host, JohnWoodJr. This is your doorway into the movement to save the Republic, the movement to realize the dream of Martin Luther King. Join us. This is the movement to build a house united. From July 5th to the 8th on the campus of Gettysburg College, located near the site of one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, in Abraham Lincoln's famed Gettysburg Address, braverangels, America's largest grassroots, cross-partisan organization dedicated to bridging the political divide, gathered hundreds of activists, elected officials, scholars, journalists, and artists together to launch a movement for civic renewal, to heal the painful divisions that are destroying American democracy. In that context, we talked about many issues at the convention. One dialogue that stood out was the conversation I was honored to moderate between Tavis Smiley, one of the foremost African-American journalists of recent decades, and a prominent liberal voice, and Ian Rowe, a conservative-leaning leader in the school choice movement with an extraordinary record of charter school development in New York through his organization Vortex Academies. Ian is also a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. The conversation dug into affirmative action in the aftermath of the recent Supreme Court decision essentially canceling race as a factor in college admissions. We talked about Justice Clarence Thomas in that context. We also got into the subject of education more broadly, particularly as it pertains to the state of Black America, and by the end of the conversation, turned to the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. This was a deep and substantive conversation, debate between two powerfully accomplished men, each of whom cared deeply about the Black community and about America, albeit coming from very different starting points on the political landscape. These are the sorts of conversations that, in my estimation, move the ball forward. And so I give you Tavis Smiley and Ian Rowe.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is JohnWoodJr. I'm braverangels National Ambassador and somebody who has been pleased to be a part of this grand enterprise for the last 5 or 6 years or so. Time starts to get away from me. And I'm also very much pleased to be joined on stage today by two close colleagues, friends, associates, dear brothers of mine, Mr. Tavis Smiley and Mr. Ian Rowe. Come join us on stage. There we go. Good to see you, man. Yeah. All right. Outstanding. And so now, normally, when I appear with either of you brothers, I don't usually have to, I usually don't have to introduce you guys, and usually you guys need no introduction. In this case, I will start off with just a few remarks from my vantage point, but I want you guys to fill in the details a little bit on who you are and how you come to us. And so, Tavis, to start with yourself first. Tavis Smiley, media entrepreneur, an icon in American journalism. If I am not mistaken, the first African-American to have his own show on both PBS and NPR. Is that correct? That's right. That's right. For many years, I think, had the highest rated show on BET, on Black Entertainment Television, if I remember that correctly. A man whose journalistic accolades could fill many walls, and somebody who's been informing the American public on a wide range of issues for years and years. And he is the owner and innovator behind KBLA in Los Angeles. I believe the only Black-owned talk radio network west of the Mississippi River. Did I get that right, Tavis? There you go. There you go. And full disclosure, if it seems like I'm being particularly laudatory towards Tavis, it's only because Tavis Smiley happens to be my other boss. I happen to have a new show myself on KBLA called The Reconstruction Project, which airs on Sunday for anybody who's in Los Angeles and listening to the radio. On the other hand, I'm joined on my right, and that wasn't meant to be metaphorical, Ian. It just kind of worked out that way. But my dear friend, my dear brother, Ian Rowe. Ian Rowe is the founder of Vortex Academies and is an entrepreneur and a leader in the educational choice movement and the charter school movement. He's somebody who is an institution builder, an educational institution builder in the Bronx and in New York. somebody who is, he's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He and I have worked together at the Woodson Center. Some of y'all will know and be familiar with the work of Bob Woodson, the Woodson Center, elevating at-risk youth, working with communities to combat poverty, illiteracy, violence, many other things. Ian worked for the Bush administration. He has worked for MTV. He's launched civic outreach campaigns, voter drive initiatives. If y'all remember the Rock the Vote campaign, that was largely the work of this man there. And of course, a great team and so forth. And so I just want to impress upon people here just how extraordinarily fortunate we are at this gathering to be joined by a very wide range of very incredible people. You've already heard from a few of them. You'll hear from a number more. But at the top of that list, in my mind, is Tavis Smiley and Ian Rowe. So, brothers, grateful to be joined by both of you. That was my cliff notes on the two of you. Anything y'all want to correct or add to the record by way of introduction?
Nothing to correct. I just want to say thank you for the invitation, John, and for the fine work that you were doing. And I'm honored to be here on the stage with Ian. Malcolm X once said that education is our passport to the future. Tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. And I'm sure we'll get into some conversation about this later, about all of the brouhaha about education right about now and how we're going to do it as we move forward. I celebrate, I said to Ian on the phone the other day, I celebrate what he's doing. It seems to me there's nothing more important than we could be doing than institution building around the issue of education. So I'm honored to be with Ian, delighted to be with John. And I should just, one shameless plug. You don't have to be in Los Angeles to listen to John on KBLA Talk 1580. If you take out your phone and download the KBLA 1580 app, one more again, KBLA 1580. Download the app and you can listen to John literally every Sunday. Our station is billed as unapologetically progressive, and John and I don't have to see everything the same way. But I think one of the things that makes America great, and here we are in Gettysburg, is that we are not afraid to re-examine the assumptions that we hold. We're not afraid to have our inventory of ideas expanded. And so here we are, a progressive talk station in Los Angeles, a flagship in LA, heard across the country, unafraid to have someone else who has a different point of view on a variety of issues on our station. So John literally just started a couple weeks ago. So John, welcome to KBLA Talk 1580, and I'm glad to be on stage with both of you today. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, brother. Absolutely. I'm going to be checking people's phones later just to make sure you got the app on it. Yeah, there you go. Got plenty of time to open your Apple Store here. Okay. And Ian, anything you want to add by way of intro for yourself?
Well, first of all, I will echo my thanks and the honor to be on stage with both of you. I mean, Tavis, it's always interesting when I meet people that I've learned so much from, how much you appreciate all the conversations you've had over the decades with people like me who are learning from the debates, the discussions you've had. If you really appreciate how much you've expanded the mindset of people like me to come to my own opinion on things. So just thank you for that. And we are coming together at a time when there seems to be a fascination with tearing institutions down or questioning fundamental principles of our country. And I do believe it is important to talk and have discussion, but also build new institutions that actually represent the principles that we're all talking about. Like, how do you create an educational institution that values viewpoint diversity and democratic discourse? You know, we just launched a high school in the Bronx organized around the 4 cardinal virtues of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. You know, yeah. You know, how do we do that? You know, we're going to talk about things like the recent affirmative action decision, which, you know, I think we'll have an interesting discussion. But one of the things it reveals, we shouldn't be waiting until entry upon college to try and figure out how to ensure all kids have opportunity. And one of the things we need to do is build great educational institutions from the earliest grades that ensure all of our kids are prepared when they get to that point of college entry.
Indeed. Well, thank you for that, Ian. And as a matter of fact, I think we will begin there. So In the conversation we're going to have here today, of course, we are all here convened at Gettysburg because we share, I think all of us, a deep-seated desire to see this nation move towards the better angels of its nature, to embrace what Dr. King referred to as the beloved community, and to allow us ourselves to be able to see and engage with the deep human dignity that exists across the political spectrum and across the racial spectrum, right? But the truth is we can't meaningfully do that unless we prove to ourselves that we can do that even in the context of disagreement. So I do want to talk to Tavis and Ian about polarization. I want to talk to them about its implications in the context of the racial conversation, American democracy more generally, and explore our common ground. But I do think it's important to maybe start on a point where we may anticipate some differences of opinion. So Tavis, I want to start with you here. The Supreme Court, now with a majority conservative bench, 3 appointees, of course, rendered by former President Trump, has effectively overturned affirmative action in education, declaring that it is unconstitutional, at least to use race as a criteria for admission selection. Many people feel that this is a threat to particularly people of color and certainly African Americans' capacity to ultimately achieve full and equal or proportional representation in higher education, to take advantage of the American dream, and that this may be evidence of a resurgent racism or discrimination, perhaps in our larger institutional society. But how do you see it?
This won't surprise you. This will not surprise you at all. I think the decision was a huge mistake. I think it is a decision that sends America in a wrong direction. With all due respect, again, this won't surprise you, so let me just put my cards on the table so we don't have to play games here. I am beyond troubled that a Supreme Court justice who used affirmative action to get into Yale would then pull the ladder up for others. It is reprehensible. It is, I think it's undemocratic. I think it's un-American. And I think more than anything else, it's hypocritical. I once asked the greatest, the GOAT, Muhammad Ali, who was a friend of mine. I was honored to, could never imagine as a kid growing up in Indiana, in Mississippi, that I'd ever meet Muhammad Ali, much less become a friend of the champs. But I once asked Ali, with all the controversy he'd endured in his life, why he thought he was so beloved by the American people. And it wasn't just lighting the torch at the Olympics in Atlanta. Why do you think he's so beloved by the American people and around the globe with all the controversy you had engaged in? You lost your belt because you wouldn't fight in the Vietnam War, and people dismissed you for that, and on and on and on the list goes of all the controversies during the life of Muhammad Ali. And he joked and kidded around for a second, as Ali was wont to do. But when I finally forced him to get serious about why he thought the American people respected and loved him so much, he said, Tavis, I suspect it's because I have never lied to the American people. Like me or loathe me, love me or hate me. You think about Ali, you gotta accept that, right? He was as advertised. He was who he was. He never lied to the American people.
And he floated like a butterfly.
And he stung like a bee.
That's right.
Yeah. And he said to me in the very next breath, something I've never forgotten and never will for as long as I live. So Tavis, I believe the American people can handle anything. The American people are resilient people, and they can handle anything except hypocrisy. Clarence Thomas is a hypocrite. You cannot take advantage of a program at every stage of your life. If Clarence Thomas had not received affirmative action, he would not have been at Yale. It was essentially affirmative action that got him a job at the EEOC. With all the other qualified justices, all the qualified jurists at that time, had Thurgood Marshall not been black, let's just keep it real, George Bush would not have picked Clarence Thomas to replace Thurgood Marshall. And so at every stage of his life, he has benefited from this corrective program called affirmative action. And for all these years now, as the longest serving jurist on the bench, he has done everything he could to pull that ladder up for others. And so I see, and I'll be quiet for the moment, I see affirmative action, always have, as an opportunity to get in the room. For all that I've accomplished in my career, been blessed to accomplish, somebody had to usher me into that room. When I got in the room, I had to be qualified. But the melanin in my skin has kept me out of so many rooms in my career that I otherwise deserved or was qualified or talented enough to be in. So I see affirmative action as a corrective program. Let me close with this. Jackie Robinson, who we all celebrate and love now, was not the first Negro who could play Major League Baseball with the white guys. There are many others. He was the first one given the opportunity to play baseball at the Major League level with the white guys. When he got there, he was able to prove himself. And America now is still a place where there's this divide, this gaping hole still exists between the have-gots and the have-nots. And Black people in particular still lag far behind in every single leading economic indicator category. And so I'm happy to have a conversation about not mending, but ending affirmative action. But you got to tell me what you're going to put in its place. And with that, I yield to my brother from Brooklyn, Ian.
Yes, indeed. And Ian, if you don't mind me setting it up just very quickly, because Tavis made me think of a number of things. Actually, the first thing he made me think of is that speaking of Jackie Robinson and speaking of Malcolm X too, who is also mentioned on the stage, for folks who are available to attend the Gettysburg drama that we're having later this evening, you can see me and Mr. Micah Christian, lead singer of Sons of Serendip, playing Malcolm and Jackie in a famous dialogue that they had. As you know, Tavis, they were public rivals in a big and bitter way. So I was reminded of that. And I was also reminded of the fact that Muhammad Ali, who was a friend of my father's, Tavis, was a Howard Bingham, who was a friend of yours, the great sports photographer and Muhammad Ali's best friend. And when I was a little kid, Ian, my dad took me to visit Howard Bingham at his home in Los Angeles. And the biggest picture that he had in the foyer was a picture that he took of Muhammad Ali and Gerald Ford. Just to remind folks that Muhammad Ali, famous for his politics as well as his fists, was nevertheless somebody who himself could reach across the aisle. So I thought that was worth noting. But on the subject of affirmative action, also Clarence Thomas, I met Justice Thomas not too long ago. Had a short but very pleasant interaction with him at an American Enterprise Institute event, the Old Parkland Conference in Dallas, Texas. And I met Justice Thomas specifically, and I didn't know we were going to go here, so forgive me, man, but I met him specifically through you, Mr. Rowe. And I know that along with Bob Woodson and Glenn Lowry, many other venerable folks, I know you have a relationship both with Justice Thomas, to some degree at least, Ian, as well as to this issue, not just from the vantage point of a political commentator, but obviously someone who me and Tavis and everybody who knows you respects as an authority in education. So Tavis took some time to lean into this issue. I'd like to invite you to do the same.
Sure. I didn't know we were going to go here either. So I feel compelled to share that. So I just launched Vertex Partnership Academies, which is a new virtues-based high school in the Bronx. And it's in District 12 in the Bronx. And in District 12, of all the students, and it's almost all low income, predominantly Black and Hispanic, of the 2,000 or so students that start ninth grade in District 12 in the Bronx, 4 years later, only 7% graduate from high school, ready for college. Meaning they start ninth grade and either drop out, or 4 years later, they actually do earn their high school diploma, but still can't do math nor reading without remediation, even if they were to go to college. And, in the wake of the Supreme Court decision, I looked at some data. These are national numbers now. In 2015, the National Center for Educational Statistics, or what's often known as the nation's report card, reported that in 2015, 18% of Black fourth graders were reading at proficiency levels as defined by the National Center for Educational Statistics. 18%. That was in 2015 for fourth graders, fourth grade Black students. In 2019, so 4 years later, so now that same cohort of eighth graders, 15% are reading at proficiency as defined by the nation's report card. So 18% of fourth graders, 4 years later, 15% of eighth graders. So now it's 2023. By all estimates, not more than 20% of now Black high school seniors are reading at what would be grade level upon graduation from high school. And the separate statistic, the College Board, who produces the SAT, each year they publish what the scores are. Most people don't know this, what actual scores are on the SAT by race, by geography, a bunch of different metrics. And there are about 170,000 or so Black students that took the SAT. This was in 2021. Only 1% scored between a 1400 and 1600, which is usually the range that is expected for top tier colleges and universities. I share this data, one, just because it's horrific and I fight every day to improve it. But the reason I run schools, particularly schools in the Bronx, is that I want our students to know that they can do hard things, right? That they can lead a self-determined life, that they can overcome the inevitable barriers that are going to come their way. And as it relates to the affirmative action decision, we have some disagreement on it. I can talk about race versus class based affirmative action, which is I'm more a proponent of class-based, like give poor kids the leg up, and then you'll actually get a lot of Black kids and a lot of poor kids of all races. But the reason I raise the data is that the challenge that our kids face is not so much now the lack of race-based affirmative action upon entry to an elite college. It's that less than 20% of our Black kids aren't reading at grade level coming out of high school. That's the huge elephant in the room that we're not addressing. And in some ways, it's a huge distraction when we're talking about race-based affirmative action. Because if you actually look at the actual cases that were adjudicated by the Supreme Court, Harvard and University of North Carolina. At Harvard, nearly 70% of the Black students that are accepted, are Black middle upper class kids. Either they're economically advantaged, they're from Nigeria, they're from West Africa, from the Caribbean. So in some ways, even affirmative action as executed right now is not helping what I think were the original Black kids that it was designed to support. So even in its current iteration, it's supporting, my kids and John's kids, who theoretically have gotten a lot of the supports that should make them able to make it on their own, which is why, again, I'm a big fan of class-based affirmative action. So that's kind of where I am. And I want to shift the attention away from, I do think the absence of race-based affirmative action hopefully will put more of a spotlight on where kids are coming out K-12, and I think it will put more of a spotlight on should we have things like legacy admissions where, so I think all that actually is good discussion that will emerge. But fundamentally, for me, we got to get to the discussion of what's happening way prior to the college application timeframe.
I just want to note very quickly that there's a distinction in issues here, which I think is important to seize upon in the context of polarization, because the way I usually see these conversations go is you might have one person say, well, race-based affirmative action is something that we need. You might have somebody else say, okay, I don't quite agree with that, but they may share a concern or a dissatisfaction with the data that you pointed to. And when the conversation is polarized, you need to have it all or none, right? You need to say, no, you need to agree with me on race-based affirmative action before we can even get to talking about how we reform things in the grade school level. But in a conversation where we are willing to identify the common ground without getting lost in the tribalism, we can hammer it out on the things we disagree on while also being able to make progress in those areas where we share a discontent with the ways in which things are not functioning in a way that serves our kids in a manner that we can all recognize is unfair. So feel free, either of you, to push back on me on that front. But Tavis, with that, I want to turn it back to you.
I don't want to push back at all. I want to, this as well may surprise you. There's nothing that Ian just said that I disagree with. Not a single thing. I'd only add 3 caveats.
Only 3.
Okay, here we go. In no particular order, they are these, and I'll be brief. 1, I take your point about what the real problem is and how we're being distracted. I don't think, though, it's either or, it's both and. It's not either or, it's both and. We have to find a way to address the inequality in education early on. I started out saying today how much I celebrate the work that you're doing in the boogie down in Bronx, in the Bronx.
J-Lo territory.
Yeah, exactly. Jenny from the block. Yeah. But it's not either or, it's both and. We have to address this crisis. Why kids, Black kids in particular, aren't being given access to an equal high quality education at a younger age, and at the same time address the absence of African Americans in elite colleges and beyond. Jesse Jackson Jr., former congressman, proposed something years ago that raised all kind of hell. And I challenge folk who see this issue differently than I do to consider the following. He proposed legislation years ago. He proposed it every year he was in Congress for a constitutional amendment that would guarantee every child in this country access, here's the language clearly, access to an equal high quality education. For all the rights we have in this country, our children are not guaranteed access to an equal high quality education. And so you ask, Tavis, what's the standard? Glad you asked. Very simple. Whatever the best is in this country, that's the standard. And we set that standard. And every child in this country is guaranteed by the Constitution equal access to a high quality education. Now, I know that doesn't judge or prejudge outcomes, nor should it. The problem is that every kid in this country doesn't start in the same place. If you live in Washington State, where they have Boeing and Microsoft and Amazon, the list goes on and on and on, you got a high tax base. You get a great education in Washington State. But if you're in Mississippi, where their greatest export is catfish, not so much. So that every child in this country doesn't start in the same place. So if we really are serious about this, let's just stop talking trash. Let's just keep it real. Keep it real. Why not guarantee every child in this country, via our Constitution, access to an equal high quality education so that every child at least starts in the same place? That's the first point. Very quickly. The second point is this. So I don't think it's either or, I think it's both and I offer that for your consideration about how to get there. I don't like to raise issues without offering some sort of solution as I see it. I think Jesse Jackson Jr. was right about that. It never got traction. He was right about it. So it's not either or, but both and. Number 2, I take your point, Ian, that many elite African Americans have access to these programs. We're talking specifically about education. And that's not true for employment. It's not necessarily true for contracting. But in the conversation about education, it is true that oftentimes elite African Americans get access to these elite schools. The problem I have with that is, as you already teed up, ain't nobody mad about the legacies. Nobody's mad about that. Nobody's mad about the athletes. Nobody mad about that. So here again, race is a part of everything in this country. You have to convince me why we're so focused on this one particular slice of who gets access, but we don't want to discuss any of the other pieces about who gets access. That's race. And it's unavoidable. It's incontrovertible. It's race at the center of our politics. And the third and final point I would simply make is that this is not the end. And Black folk ain't stupid. This is the beginning. It starts with doing away with affirmative action in education. And next will be employment. Next will be contracting. How do I know this? Because I live in California, where John Wood Jr. lives. And our friend Ward Connolly did this successfully in California, and other states followed. So it won't stop at just education. They will go and go and go until they can't go any further to eliminate race as a keyword, a factor in anything that we do. I'll stop for now.
Ian, respond to any piece of that you like, but I would be curious to know where you come down on the legacy admissions, because actually in response to this decision, I think there has been an uptick in conversation on that front.
And in fact, Harvard was just sued. There's a suit against Harvard, which the reason I think the Supreme Court decision couldn't address legacy issues and some of the other kids of donors and all that is that the only prism through which they could look at this case is the Constitution and the Equal Protection Clause. So I think the Supreme Court could only address race-based affirmative action as a discriminatory practice. So, as far as legacy, I do think it should essentially be eliminated. The one thing I think the thing that we have to recognize, though, is that if you look at a lot of legacy sort of admit part of, or alumni, I guess, they're many of the ones who are writing the big ticket checks for scholarships, particularly for low income kids. So in that discussion, we want to figure out a way. If you eliminate one, it's like always, you got to look at like what Thomas Sowell says. There are no solutions, only trade-offs, right? And so. So that's just something I think if legacy admissions are eliminated as a preference, which I support, we should not be uncognizant of what impact that could have on donations that come from that community. So anyway, that's a point there. Athletes are harder. Notice, a lot of the school, all these elite schools have put out statements since the decision basically saying, we'll comply with the law, but we're still going to figure out a way to get Black kids in. But they're not mentioning legacy. They're not mentioning the children of donors. They're not mentioning athletics. So it'll be interesting to see how these self-righteous institutions act. Yesterday, some of you may have read the New York Times had a series of essays on what should we do now. And I think Richard Collenberg had a column basically advocating a position I agree on, which is let's replace, if you're going to have affirmative action, let's have economic-based preferences, not race-based. But the great Roland Fryer, did you see this piece?
Yes, sir.
He had a great piece, and I'm going to reach out to him to see if I can help figure out a way to make it happen. But he's saying, look, if you Harvard, if you Yale, if you UNC are so concerned about this issue, there's nothing stopping you as an institution with huge endowments of launching a charter school within your community, right? So imagine, it's such a simple, sometimes the most brilliant ideas are like, why didn't I think of that? After you've heard it. But he's saying, look, what if the top tier, create 100 charter schools, high schools, and optimally middle school, where these institutions are taking these students under their wing and creating a whole new pipeline of talent. And these colleges and universities would have a better sense of what the challenges are that are facing kids that live in the Bronx and Appalachia and all these communities that they're not tapping into today. Because I can tell you, when I run our schools in the Bronx, there are things that I experience or I observe of our students that I don't think the admissions officers really have a sense of what is going on in their lives.
I know John wants to jump in. If I could just add two quick things in 30 seconds, though. I know you want to move past this issue. I saw Roland's piece, as you did, and Roland's brilliant. I've known him for years and interviewed him a number of times. And yet I think what his piece misses is that still only addresses a small number.
Oh yeah, necessary but not sufficient. Yeah. Necessary but not sufficient. I agree with that.
Nice phrase. I'll take that. Necessary but not sufficient, because, and that's my larger issue with what you're doing. The question is, how do we make? I've had this debate so many times about school choice. I'm sick of having it, right? But it's a worthy conversation, and I've come to sum up my feelings about it in a very simple sentence. I ain't got a problem with school choice. The question is, how do we make all schools choice? That's my issue. Never wrong with school choice. How do you make all schools choice? And we don't have a conversation that's universal enough for me. So there's a tier, there's a slice of folk who get impacted by this, but the rest of these black and brown students are still stuck right where they are in bad public schools, dilapidated schools, books that are torn apart, et cetera, et cetera. You take my point, I'll move on from that. The other point I want to make very quickly about affirmative action, though, is going to be fascinating. So I'm always trying to think ahead, right? Trying to figure where's this going next. As I said earlier, they start with education. It's not going to end there. The Supreme Court, I always remind my audience every day on the radio, chooses the cases it wants to hear. It's a very, very important point that we lose sight of in our democracy. Our Supreme Court is the most powerful court in the entire world. There is no Supreme Court that has the power that our court has. I think it has too much power, quite frankly, and they serve for too long. Another conversation, another time. We got to do some revisions there. My point simply is this. They have all this power. And these decisions that they make impact us, for the rest of our lives, right? And I'm concerned about the fact that they get to choose what they want to hear. They wanted to hear a case that would allow them to do what they did. Mark my word, they want to hear another case in the not too distant future that would allow them to attack the same issue in employment, in contracting. You heard it from Tavis at Gettysburg. It's going to happen. It is just a matter of time. And here's what I'm getting to very quickly. When we get to the issue of employment, and when we get to the issue of contracting, it's going to be very, very fascinating, particularly on contracting, because nobody wants to talk about this as well. Let's just keep it real. A significant number of folk in this country who benefited from affirmative action are white women. And I might add, the white men who they're married to and who are the fathers of their children. Because so many of these companies are listed in the name of the wife as the owner. It's the oldest trick in the book. So they can take advantage of the MBE, WBE programs. It's going to be a very, very different conversation. You can poo-poo the education debate all you want. When we get to contracting, a lot of white folk are going to be impacted by affirmative action in that regard. And then I think the conversation is going to be a lot more nuanced than it is right about now, but I digress for the moment.
Got it. Okay. One last point about
real quick.
Choice. So in that same district in which we just opened up our high school, where only 7% of kids graduate from high school ready for college, there's a cap. There's a legislative barrier on opening new charter schools, right? So New York City as a whole has about 60,000 kids on the wait list for public charter schools. And these are almost all low-income families who are just desperate for their kids to have a shot, right? I mean,
I saw your documentary.
What's that? Yes.
Waiting for Superman.
Waiting for Superman, yes.
There's a great documentary about that. I saw that. Yeah.
Yes. So when you talk about, choice and a guarantee, not to get too polarized, but this year, the governor of New York proposed the audacious idea to eliminate the cap, so that if there were education entrepreneurs like me that wanted to launch new schools in these communities, they would have the ability to provide an application and compete for the opportunity to run a great school, especially in low-income communities. She's a Democratic governor. Literally the day after she made this announcement, the head of the state assembly, and unfortunately, I'll say it, predominantly Black, predominantly Democrat, leaders came forward and said, no way, this will ruin public education. This cannot stand. And what did Governor Hochul do? She quietly rescinded her proposal, and the cap still remains. And so everything you just, of course, absolutely, that's the key. That a kid should have the ability to go to a great school within their neighborhood, that meets their values, and that they have a choice. Because, by the way, one person's great is, so that's the whole idea. Just like middle and upper class families have the choice today by either moving to a nice neighborhood or choosing a private school. That doesn't exist for the most vulnerable of our society.
What concerns those legislators, as you know, we don't have time to get into this. I don't want to get ahead of John. What concerns those legislators, and it concerns me as well, it's another conversation for another time, is privatization. And I think many of us suffer because of privatization in this country, and we continue to move more and more in that direction. And so when you see Democrats jump up and say it's a bad idea, it's not because we don't want our kids to be educated. That's not the point. The question that we don't want to wrestle with is, what does it mean to privatize every sector of American life? That's a very different conversation.
And what do you mean? Do you mean for profit? What do you mean? What do you mean by privatization?
Yeah, well, that it's not. Well, that's a very good question. There are a number of ways to define that. One is it's money making.
This is the point where a moderator starts thinking, okay, at what point do we take the off ramp, or how do we keep going down the freeway? I'm gonna let y'all keep going. I'm just making it up.
No, but it's good because this actually is the crux of it, right?
There are a number of ways to define it, and it depends on what sector of government we're talking about. There is privatization for the purpose of making money. The prison industrial complex. That's privatized. That's all about making money. You're warehousing black and brown men, just keep it real again, but you're making a bunch of money off of that. That's one definition of privatization. Another definition is that schools get to decide who they let in. That's the way of looking through a privatization prism, that you decide who gets in. And the rest of us are damned to perdition. So again, I take John's point, and he's the moderator. I don't want to get too far afield, but there are a variety of ways to define privatization. And all I'm trying to say is that when we have these conversations and people think that Democrats or black folk or people on the left or progressives like me have knee-jerk responses and say, oh, no, we can't do that. Well, hold up, brother. It's not just that we are against a good idea. I say all the time, I would much prefer a good idea than a particular ideology. I'll take a good idea over ideology any day of the week. But when people push back on those things, there are reasons for that. And I think people are concerned, again, that it destroys public education potentially. And even if you don't accept the phrase that it destroys public education, we still haven't addressed the issue of how we do the best for the greater good. How do we serve the biggest number of children? And it's not through a charter process, even though you're doing great work in the Bronx.
All right, brothers and sisters, thank you very much. Let me just propose.
We have to lock hands. I think there's a path forward for us on this. I really do.
And in that spirit, Ian, let me just propose that on this aspect of the conversation, education, privatization, affirmative action, et cetera, that we continue this conversation on KBLA and the Brave Rangers podcast. So there you go. All right, y'all. Yeah, download the app, subscribe where you get your podcasts. Okay. I want to move us forward, and I want to make time for your questions too, because we actually have a little more time for this session than I originally realized, and I do want to open it up to Q&A as we get past the half-hour mark a little bit. But I do want to talk a little bit on the level of values, things that are a bit a priori to politics. And it's a funny thing, because when I realized that we might have the opportunity to broker a conversation between the two of you, I thought to myself, well, Tavis Smiley, Ian Rowe, these are individuals with distinctly, differing overall sort of political orientations, but I can see potentially some real convergence on the level of deeper values, deeper concerns. And I want to explore that a little bit and still open room for tension to potentially emerge if there is any. But the way I want to go into this is, Ian, I want to invite you to share with us a little bit about your own formula, because I think it starts this values conversation off right. You have written about this idea of FREE as an acronym that sort of encapsulates the formula for success that's applicable to all people, but that I think you think may be particularly beneficial for poor and underserved kids, and certainly Black and brown kids and families. But it's I know that there's a policy sort of extension of this formula for you, but I really want to key in on it as a statement of your values and see, sort of how Tavis relates to that. Can you tell us about FREE?
Sure. So like all of us, we were talking earlier about 30 years ago, the Rodney King trials, or the riots. We've all been in this work long enough that, and me in particular, I've worked with young people of every conceivable background, whether it was Rock the Vote or my time at MTV, time in the White House with No Child Left Behind. I've seen young people, rich kids, poor kids, black kids, white kids, Hispanic kids, Asian kids, kids in foster care, kids in homeless shelters. I've seen kids in very challenging situations as they now make their decisions, as they enter young adulthood, unfortunately make the kinds of decisions where they essentially recreate the same dysfunction that they experienced as a child, right? They just perpetuated this cycle of disadvantage. And yet I've seen other kids in those same exact challenging situations, domestic violence, divorce, abuse, neglect, as they enter young adulthood, make different sets of decisions. And the animating question of my life, frankly, is what makes the difference? What is it that differentiates that young person who recreates their disadvantage versus those that break the cycle? Is it just random? Is it just, one's a LeBron James and they could just bounce a basketball out of poverty, right? Is there anything that's common? And my observations is that there are certain things that have been in common based on my observations. And the single greatest characteristic that I've seen of young people who were able to break the cycle of disadvantage was that they had a sense of personal agency in their own lives, right? They felt they had the ability to lead what I call a self-determined life, even in the face of opposition. And agency, I define as the force of your free will guided by moral discernment, right? The force of your free will guided by moral discernment. Because for these young people who were able to break the cycle of disadvantage, it's not that they just had agency out of nowhere. They didn't just pull themselves up by the bootstraps and they just knew the right thing to do. In my observation, there were 4 pillars that their lives were connected to in one way or another. And those 4 pillars are what is my free framework: family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. Free. And I'll just quickly go through it. But family, the one of the biggest observations I've had for young people who are able to break the cycle of disadvantage, they recognized that their future wasn't necessarily bound by the family that they're from. It was much more about the family that they were on the way to form. So that's why in our schools, for example, we teach something called the success sequence. If you're familiar with that terminology, that's data that says if a young person of any background finishes just their high school degree, then gets a full-time job of any kind, just so they can learn the dignity and discipline of work. And then if they have children, if they got married first, that's that order of decisions: education, work, marriage, then children. 97% of millennials who follow that series of decisions in that order avoid poverty. And the vast majority enter the middle class or beyond. Now, it's not 100% because nothing in life is guaranteed, but we teach our kids that, not in a prescriptive way saying you must do this, but in a descriptive way saying you're going to be making big decisions over the course of your life, particularly over the course of the next 10 years of your life around education, relationships, work. You should know this. And so that's one of the, and so that is one aspect, and I write about this in my book, Agency. That's the first aspect of family. Having young people understand that one of the most profound decisions they will make as a human being is to bring another human being into the world, and that there are better pathways to make that big decision. So that's the F in free. The second is R for religion. My observation of seeing young people who were able to break the cycle of disadvantage is that they had some kind of personal faith commitment in their lives, typically informed by a organized religion. They lived by a moral code, and they were typically part of a larger community with weekly rituals like going to church, where they were part of a community of people that expected them to live up to this moral code. And if you look at the data, even though religiosity is unfortunately on the decline, huge differences in terms of isolation, depression, loneliness, suicidal ideation, all the things, even pornography consumption, dramatic differences between young people who have a personal faith commitment and do not. So that's my second observation. My third observation, young people who were able to break the cycle of disadvantage benefited from educational choice and school freedom. It's just fundamental to the story. And then the very last E is for entrepreneurship, in some ways informed by, if you're on the pathway to form a strong family, if you have a strong personal faith commitment, if you've benefited from educational freedom, that usually leads to the last E, which is that you have an entrepreneurial mindset. You are a problem solver. You're an overcomer when challenges come your way. So that's the framework I've presented. Free is my pathway for young people to have an empowering alternative to the narratives that today, in my view, are sending a message of victimhood and grievance as opposed to hope and agency.
Thank you, Ian. And just as a note to myself and us, I still want to get to the point to where we can. This conversation has been so rich and deep. Of course, I came into it with the plan, and of course, my plan went out the window within about 20 minutes. I still want to get to where we can talk a little bit about the legacy of Dr. King, some of the other things we mentioned. But Tavis, the reason I wanted Ian to go into that formulation was because, again, obviously, and you can see the application of all of that in Ian's work. But I also take it as a value statement. And I'll tell you, Tavis, that before you and I first met, one of the things that I learned about you and was touched in learning about you was in hearing you talk about your upbringing, the importance of the role of your father, what he meant to you, right? Your family. The way that your connection to your church, to the Black church, was a connection to the larger Black community and what was otherwise, I mean, don't let me steal your thunder here, of course, but it was something that I think had clearly a formative impact on you. And obviously you're famously somebody who values education and embodies entrepreneurialism. And so I'm curious to get your response to what Ian said, particularly if you take that as a bit of a values statement. And, is there anything, what resonates with you there? And is there anything that misses for you?
If it makes you feel any better, first of all, Mike Tyson, at one point, as you know, lost the heavyweight championship of the world to Buster Douglas. Mm-hmm. And they asked him, I said, "Champ, what happened? Didn't you have a plan?" He said, "Yeah, I had a plan. Everybody got a plan until they get hit." And so you weren't the only one who had a plan that went awry. So let me
as long as I don't have to suck up any right hands.
Yeah. Let me just say a few things. One, I listened to Ian lay out that framework. It's beautiful, by the way. And I think for the most part, I have, in my lifetime, certainly as an adolescent, was adjacent to most of those things. Maybe not so much the last E, but the first three, certainly I'm blessed to have been, a very poor family, but I had family. And my parents valued education. And I grew up in a Black church. So I understand those things quite nicely. Again, the entrepreneurship thing came later for me. But that's number one. Number two, I've argued for many, many years now. I read a book many years ago, and I highly recommend it if you can find it. It may still be in publication. I don't know. But I read a book years ago called Educating for Character by a guy named Thomas Lacona. Powerful book. One of the most amazing books I've ever read. Educating for Character by Thomas Lacona. And what Mr. Lacona argues in this book is that we should seriously consider in this country a values education curriculum in our schools. And I've long supported that. I'm a progressive, an unapologetic progressive, but I've long supported a values education curriculum in our schools. Because of the way the world is going, so many of our young people don't have access to the kind of values education that I received in my home. And so I strongly support a values education curriculum in our schools, and I became convinced it was worthy to do so when I read that book by Thomas Lacona, once again, called Educating for Character. There's not a lot that Ian said that I disagree with, but there is, again, another caveat here. As I listen to you talk, we've invoked the name of Dr. King a number of times in this conversation. You will never hear me present anywhere without mentioning the name of Dr. King. And I say that because while we were in Gettysburg, with all due respect to Mr. Lincoln, this is my own personal assessment, I still regard Dr. King as the greatest American this country has ever produced. That's my assessment. And if you want to fight, I'll meet you in the lobby after we talk. I'll debate you on Lincoln. I'll debate you on FDR, and I'll give you my rationale.
You got to do it nonviolently.
When I have more time. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Nonviolently, yeah.
We can shadow box.
Yeah, there you go. But I regard King as the greatest American this country's produced. That's, again, my own individual assessment. I wrote a book about the last year of his life called Death of the King, which explores why I love Dr. King so much. You have to see him in the last year. The other years are important, but the last year of his life, you have to see King in those dark moments to really appreciate who he was. But I say that because King talked about what he called a revolution of values. It troubles me in this country that we act like Dr. King only gave one speech in his life, and we act like the speech only had one line in it. And my conservative Republican friends love to take this line and bastardize it and twist it like a pretzel, that I want my children to live in a nation where they'll not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the... And they twist that thing to mean everything they want it to mean. That is not... Exactly. And I hate it when they take that word, that phrase rather, and bastardize it in ways that King wouldn't recognize were he here today. King gave a lot of speeches in his life, and frankly, the I Have a Dream speech is not the greatest. We think it's the greatest because we hear it all the time. But he talked often about what he called a revolution of values. So I want to just make this a little bit bigger than the frame, if I can. I love Ian's frame, but I want to expand it. It may help our conversation, I don't know. But King is talking about a revolution of values in this country. And I raise that because I don't think you can disconnect the revolution of values that King was talking about and the values education curriculum that Ian is talking about. You can't disconnect those two things. I used the word hypocrisy earlier. Here's the problem in our country. The hypocrisy is this is the frame that we want these black and brown kids to operate inside of. Use the word narrative. But that ain't the narrative the country gives them. This country is not serious about a revolution of values of its own. And these kids are not stuck on stupid. They can see that. They can see the frame we want to put them in is not the frame that America operates inside of. I hope that we'll get to a point in my lifetime, maybe not, where America will truly become a nation as good as its promise. But there's a huge gap between the promise of America and the possibility in America for all of our citizens. And these young folks see that. King would grade America, I don't get too far afield here, but he would grade America, if I can use the phrase, on this scorecard. This would be his grading system. He said that the triple threat that was facing America was our real problem. He called that triple threat racism, poverty, and militarism. So I asked you to grade America not by Joe Biden or Donald Trump, Republican, Democrat, matters not, when they stand up in the well of the Congress every year and lie to the American people and tell us that the state of our union is strong. It's a lie. The state of our union is not strong. Our democracy is in peril. It's fragile. But they keep lying and telling us that. Poverty is threatening our democracy. As there are any number of other issues I'd go into if I had the time. The point I want you to focus on, that I want us to think about, is simply this: that America has to undergo its own revolution of values before we try to convince black and brown kids that they need to undergo a revolution of values. This is the system that they live inside of. And when they see the inequity, when they see the unfairness, when they see the income inequality, when they see the poverty, when they see the economic immobility, when they see the environmental racism, I could do this all day if I had the time. That's the system that they have to live inside of. And I say this simply, people would rather see a sermon than hear a sermon. They'd rather see one than hear one. So we keep preaching about this notion of values, which again, I don't disagree with at all. I'm just saying the frame is larger. I'm okay to have a conversation about values for Black kids. But what about values for our country? And that's what King was pushing America toward, a revolution of values. I'm going to say one last thing that's going to shock you. So it's kind of like a plane taking off and you're going through turbulence. I'm going to ask you to hold on to your seat right quick. I'm going to tell you something you probably don't know, but I write about this, of course, in my book, Death of a King. And I'll just give you the very short version. Dr. King, as you all know, killed on the balcony in Memphis, Lorraine Motel. The last phone call he had before he walked on the balcony and was shot was a conversation with his secretary back at Ebenezer Church in Atlanta, where he pastored. Her name was Dora McDonald. And no matter where King was every week, he would always get back to Atlanta on Sunday mornings to preach at Ebenezer. He would always call Dora Thursday, Friday at the latest to give her the sermon topic for that Sunday morning, because back in the day, we'd have a bulletin when you got to church. They'd pass out the church bulletin with the order of service, the sermon, the page in the back to put your notes. So they had to get this thing printed. So he had to always call by Thursday, Friday morning at the latest to give Dora his sermon for the week. And Dr. King told Dora McDonald on that phone call that the title of his Sunday morning sermon, had he made it back to Atlanta, would be entitled, "Why America May Go to Hell." Now, all you know is the I Have a Dream guy. This is King in 1968, who was about to preach a sermon called "Why America May Go to Hell." And the sermon would have been built around this notion of pushing America toward a revolution of values. And so I close by saying I'm all for that. Again, it's amazing the things that you and I agree on. No disagreement with that whatsoever. As I said earlier, I've been subject to that in most of my life. But I also understand that these children are raised in a country that needs its own revolution of values. And when they see one thing, when they hear one narrative, but we push something else on them, hypocrisy. I digress.
Ladies and gentlemen, a generous round of applause for Tavis Smiley and Ian Rowe. Thank you both. So I want to pivot towards questions, but I do want to preface that with a short statement of my own, particularly pivoting off of the introduction of Dr. King to the conversation. And I'll start with that simply by noting this. You know, Tavis, when you and I first connected, I considered it to be a deep point of connection that we, both have this desire to see the legacy and philosophy of King in all of its complexity, by the way, sort of more deeply introduced into the public conscience. I've heard you say that part of what King advanced was putting love forward in the public square, and that we need to put love back in the public square today. And I would argue that it is in that vein that Dr. King, among others, and of course, we are here, as you mentioned, Tavis, in Gettysburg, 160 years, almost to the day, I think, of the Battle of Gettysburg, 160 years from the Gettysburg Address. But we're also 60 years out from the I Have a Dream speech. And of course, Tavis, I would say that it was a great speech. I share your desire for that not to be the end-all, be-all of what anybody knows about King, right? But we are living in history. And Dr. King's relevance for me, even if you might, from one side or the other, look at the particulars of Dr. King's politics and render any opinionated judgment that you might like. But the idea that, as many of you have heard me say, that love is a spiritual power that can affect social transformation, that goodwill has the power to transform us on the level of our conscience as Americans. If we have nothing else in common with Brave Angels, we ought to believe in that. Because otherwise, there's no basis for friendship. There's no basis for trust. if we don't have a deep sense of human goodwill towards one another, in spite of everything that's piled on top of that. And so in that sense, you know, the work of Braver Angels, and certainly the work of my life, has been deeply informed by the legacy of Dr. King. And so I want to turn to questions, but I do want to invite a very special friend of mine. Do we have our microphone in motion? Okay, there we go. Professor Harry Boyd, if you don't mind standing up for us for just a quick moment. Professor Boyd is a friend of mine and somebody who I will allow to introduce himself, but he's a longtime leader at Braver Angels, voice of conscience for many, somebody who's an authority in philosophical nonviolence, and somebody who, of course, was actually there at that speech, Tavis. And so if we can bring the microphone over to him.
Can I just add for 30 seconds while she's bringing the microphone? Yes. What you just said is very powerful, and I want to just put this out before the brilliant professor speaks. When King talks of love, it's important to define that word. I just want to put this out for you to consider as the professor speaks. When King's talking about love, as he often did, it was his ethos, right? King's definition of love is simply this: that everybody is worthy just because.
That's right.
Everybody is somebody's child, and everybody's somebody's kid. And everybody is equally worthy just because, period, hard stop. It doesn't matter your color, your ethnicity, your race, your religion, your economic income, who your mom and them are, how much money they make, what kind of car you drive, what neighborhood you live in. Everybody is equally worthy just because. Now imagine, and I'll shut up and you to the professor, imagine if we could ever operationalize that definition in our politics, in our public policy. Imagine advancing public policy based upon the simple notion that every citizen is equally worthy just because. It changes how we do education. It changes how we do healthcare. I'll shut up, you take my point. If everybody were equally worthy just because, it fundamentally changes America. Professor, I'm sorry.
Well, I don't think of myself as a professor so much as a lowly field secretary for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference who used to drive Dr. King to the airport. And occasionally would play a game of ping pong with him. I heard Dr. King practice I Have a Dream the night before he gave it on my father's sleeping bag, or my father's hotel, the floor of my father's hotel room. I was in the sleeping bag. I was a kid. Dad had just gone on staff as the first white person on the staff of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so I couldn't agree with you more that in my view, Dr. King is the luminous figure out of American history. I do have a couple of other comments about this. One is he didn't simply say just because. He said because we all are made in the image of God. And he said that again and again. He was deeply convinced, and he could see the spirituality of even his enemies. So that you can't separate his notion, which was agape or public love, from his depth of his religious belief. But he and James Lawson and Bayard Rustin and many others also believed that the great religions of the world, certainly Hindu and Jain religion and Buddhism and Jewish religion, all had that sense of the sacredness of the person. And then for people who were unbelievers, they talked about belief in the inviolable dignity of the person. So one of the things that makes me uneasy about Dr. King and the legacy of the movement and conventional discussions of education is the individualist quality of the discussion. I mean, King also, I've been doing a lot of work on this, and the citizenship schools, which I worked as a staff person in SCLC citizenship schools, they grew out of 60 years of Black schools. They were called the Rosenwald schools. Black communities built 5,300 schools. They built them. They got a little bit of money from a fund at Tuskegee called the Rosenwald Fund. But communities built them and they own them. And they were the sources of strength and development. And also a different understanding of education, which was about education is about everybody. It's not about winnowing out the stars or the people who go to elite schools. There were two principles that the Jeans teachers, who was the organizers of those communities, held. First of all, they believed that education was about citizenship. And citizenship involved having a responsibility to your community to give back, because it was the whole community that educated you. But it also was responsibility to be a change agent. They were fighting the radical dehumanization of African Americans. They knew segregation was wrong. And they were politically savvy like we just don't see these days. They were organizers who figured out how to make alliances with whites who were sympathetic to Black education, bring in rural whites into the libraries that they created, work with all sorts of institutions to get those schools. That is a legacy of collective endeavor, and education is collective, that we need to remember, because that actually is the only future of a democratic society if we see that we are all in it together. And as Howard Thurman, a great inspiration, the King put it, we need a politics which is deeper and more powerful and more transformative than anything we have ever seen in America. And we need a politics based on the premise that everyone has great potential. Every single person has potential, and every single person has dignity. So I think this is good. I think there are a lot of dimensions to Dr. King and his philosophy, and also the educational traditions, the HBCUs out of which he came and he was schooled by. And it's easy to talk about elite colleges, but there's a legacy that we have largely forgotten as a whole society that is tremendously important. That saw every child as having value.
Yeah, indeed. Professor Boyd, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us and lending the benefit of your wisdom. I'd like to invite quick reflections from either or both of you if you want, but I also want to get some more folks' questions in.
Well, I was just going to comment on the Rosenwald schools, how many folks are familiar with the Rosenwald schools? This is always a heartbreak for me, that there isn't more awareness of the greatness of, it's worth just spending 40 seconds on it, but well, I'm running a school that's going to make sure our kids know about the Rosenwald schools. So Booker T. Washington connected with Julius Rosenwald, who at the time was the CEO of Sears, Roebuck Company, which, that was the Walmart of the day. And this was during Jim Crow segregation. This is when Black schools were segregated, horrifically low resources. And Booker T. Washington said, we do not have to accept the standard for our schools, for our education of Black kids. And throughout the South, I think there are 14 states in the South, they built, it was 5,300. I normally say about 5,000, but it's in that order of magnitude. And you're right. There was a great level of community ownership over the construction of those schools, Black principals, Black teachers, an incredible example of self-determination during Jim Crow. And most people don't know this aspect. It was the Brown versus Board of Education decision that made the fundamental observation that separate meant unequal and thus inherently inferior, that it essentially deemed the Rosenwald schools, these incredible all-Black schools, unconstitutional. So why don't we have Rosenwald schools today is because the Supreme Court decision that we all hail as so incredible actually nullified one of the greatest examples. I mean, I'd love to hear your observation about this. One of the greatest examples of self-determination of Black education. It's incredible.
I just want to underscore, if I can, the irony of where we are now. I take your point, but look where we are now in the aftermath of this recent Supreme Court decision on affirmative action. If I've read one, I've read I've read more articles I can count now. I'm tired of reading all the articles about the opportunity this is for the HBCUs now. That article's everywhere. What a great opportunity for HBCUs now that these Negroes can't get into the elite schools. So look, you see my point, right? Look where we've come. So the critique, the criticism that we typically get is that we don't want to be in segregated spaces in America. We don't want that. But yet everybody now is looking to HBCUs to save the day. That education, the affirmative action education, has been gutted. It's a sick and sad, and at the same time, in some ways, funny irony. But I digress.
Thank you, Tavis. Okay, hands up. And let's see. Oh, yeah. I guess I gotta actually pick people, right? That's tough. Okay, my brother over here in the back with the laptop. Tell us your name, man. Tell us where you're from.
My name is Corey. I'm originally from Chicago, and now I live in Washington, D.C.
Good to have you here.
Thank you. So I want to ask a general question. I think that we can all acknowledge that, racism, unfortunately, still plays a role in American life. But on the question of things like racial preferences, I think the question really I have is I don't see how those things necessarily benefit, considering the fact that particularly one thing we didn't talk about is that when it comes to things like Ivy League admissions and stuff like that, it's overwhelmingly the people who benefit from that are usually like Black immigrants and, people from, Nigeria, Kenya, things like that. I mean, I've been on Ivy League campuses. Most of the Blacks I meet are not necessarily descendants of American slavery, Jim Crow. So I think the question is would you say that a lot of these sorts of like racial preference policies more of like a distraction from the actual legitimate issues that are actually there? Yeah, that actually exists.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the question. Yeah. We did cover that ground, I think, pretty good in the conversation. But if either or both of you want to offer just a very quick summation of your...
No, that was the point I was making earlier. And again, if you look at the actual cases that were adjudicated in this Supreme Court decision, Harvard, nearly 70% of the Black students were just as you described, upper middle class, often recent immigrants, or children of native-born American, but upper middle class, well-educated. They're the ones their kids went to prep in New York and private schools. Yeah. And so that's part of, again, which is why for me, if we are going to have affirmative action, and economic-based affirmative action would be, I believe, more powerful and reach, I think, the very people that we all think should have. If there's going to be a leg up, then let's give it to low-income kids of all races who've demonstrated academic prowess. But most importantly, we got to get back to the K-12 system to ensure that all kids are actually, with choice, are being prepared in a way that they can compete. Yeah. And by the way, even at our school, at the end of 10th grade, our students will be able to choose either a college university pathway or a pathway of careers where they can do apprenticeships in junior and senior year. The other thing we have to lose this idea, this obsession that college is the only option after high school.
Thank you, Ian. Tavis, you spoke to that earlier. Do you want to reiterate? Are you good? Okay. All right. So let's keep going. More hands. I see Mark Beckwith here, the turquoise. And Mark, if you can be concise, just so we can try and get as many folks.
Mark Beckwith from New Hampshire. And as a country, we're wrestling with reparations. Certainly the institution I represent, the Episcopal Church, is trying to figure that out. Sometimes that term just turns people off. How do we engage in reparations beyond just saying we're support it, and how do we make it manifest in our country?
Yeah. Hey, Will, can we get another hour on the clock for this one?
Yeah, we need another symposium for that. Let me just say I am, in this regard, proud to live in California. I say all the time on the radio every day. Again, my station is flagship in L.A., heard across the country. But I say all the time that what happens in California politics either casts a long shadow or a long sunbeam across the country. I hope that what we're trying to do in California will cast a long sunbeam and not a long shadow. Gavin Newsom's acting a little funny lately. He's starting to moonwalk like Michael Jackson on this reparations issue. Even though it was his idea to do this task force that now he has problems with. I digress on that point again. But I'm hoping that we will be able to show the country a model with what we're doing in California. Again, we could spend hours talking about this, but it is about reparative justice. And I'm the first to tell you it's about more than just a paycheck. There are any number of ways to define reparations, and I think we're gonna work through that in the legislature in California right now. But again, I'm hopeful that in the not too distant future, California will give the country a model for how to wrestle with that question in the coming years.
Ian, how should we be engaging the question of reparations?
This is a much longer discussion.
I'm sorry.
Because, Nicole Hannah-Jones, the author of the New York Times 1619 Project, or lead author, wrote an 8,000-word essay in the magazine called "What We Are Owed." It's actually a brilliant essay. If you want to read a case for reparations, second to Ta-Nehisi Coates's in the Atlantic. But basically, she makes the case that the U.S. government must pass a policy that's valued at about $13 to $14 trillion that has to just be paid to Black people. And there's certain criteria. You have to identify as Black as for the last 10 years, or so there's certain criteria. But in it, she says that I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but this is basically the point. The point is, it doesn't matter, this is what her words, it doesn't matter what a Black person does. This is what they've been told to do. It doesn't matter if you get educated. It doesn't matter if you buy a home. It doesn't matter if you save. It doesn't matter if you get married. In her words, none of those things, quote, can overcome 400 years of racialized plundering, end quote. And again, I'm an educator constantly in the sense of what are the messages that we're sending to young people, right? So when I read those words, I mean, I could read them as an adult and kind of get the sense. And by the way, for what it's worth, Nicole Hannah-Jones has done all four of those things in her own life to lead a very prosperous life. And good for her, because I think she's understood the anchors that much more likely lead to a fulfilling life. But when I think of the message to young people, if you hear that message over and over and over and over again, it doesn't matter what you do based on your skin color, I think that plays into the narrative that yields a sense of either why bother or the system is rigged against me. And so I fight against that. I want young people to know the empowering strategies that they have at their avail. So if we define reparations as investing in our K-12 system so that every kid has an opportunity to go to a great school, if we have more larger narratives and campaigns about how to build strong families, to revitalize faith, then I'm down with the program. But when it's usually in the form of government money falling from the sky, I actually think in a way it will hurt the very people that we think it's intended to help.
Okay. I know Tavis has got a response. This is a long conversation. Let me suggest that we add this to the agenda for KBLA and for the podcast. All right, because I want to keep you brothers talking. Okay, God, this is really tough. I'm so sorry. We've got hands up. I want to. Oh, jeez. Okay, I want to throw it to the voice of reason in the back and then come back to the young lady in the scarf up here if we have time. So, Casey, I'm sending you all around the room. And I'm sorry, I know the room's left and right. I'm just looking right down the middle. Thank you, brother. We got Philly.
Peace. What's the deal? Arson, the voice of reason, Philadelphia representative, representing Gangsta Grass, the world's greatest bluegrass hip-hop band.
All right.
First and foremost, shout out to the God, Tavis Smiley. We glad you're here, bro.
Thank you.
As an MC, I can't steal this. This is not my own. My partner here, Dolio the Sleuth, actually sent me a text message when you were breaking down your whole free concept, right? And he said that if you add dignity, opportunity, and mentorship to those,
you get freedom.
You get freedom.
That's bars.
That's the God MC right there, Dolio the Sleuth, Pensacola, Florida representative.
All
so
right,
what I'm saying is, it feels like with, you dropped a little science with the free thing, but it feels like when all of that is brought up, it really is leaving out the idea, like you were just saying about what the sister said about the reparations thing, that like, yeah, you can do all of those things, right? But there's still the weight of all of that 400 years on you. How does it how is it that just sort of ignoring that is the way when it's so heavy and so blatant?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, how do you just get past all that and ignore, all of that other weight on you?
Yeah. Ian, respond to that. And then to my sister here, I'm going to need you to top that when you ask your question. Okay. So, all right, but go ahead.
No, it's a great question because, like, I don't view, like, what I do as ignoring that history that we're talking about. I guess I see it in trying to put in the context, like when I shared that story earlier about the Governor Hochul, making this proposal, and then the number of elected officials saying, no, we're not going to do that, essentially ending the idea of freedom. I was in Albany the next week trying to fight to provide a counter idea that whether it's the 400 years of racialized plundering or present day elected officials stopping opportunity, maybe in some way I don't draw a distinction between those two, because the impact is that the kids in my community still don't have an opportunity to get on the first rung of what we would want to accomplish. As it relates to reparations specifically, again, I actually would love to have a discussion on this, because it is not clear to me that simply money falling from the sky from the government is going to get the intended outcomes that we are all fighting for our kids. And I know it's a longer conversation, but I just know that there are other paths. By the way, the one that Nikole Hannah-Jones followed in her own life. And that, by the way, that's not casting dispersions on her. That's good for her. I wish more young people knew the lives that most Black people, and most Black people in this country are not in jail, not in the criminal justice. They're living their lives. They're married, and so that just needs to be as prominent a subject matter as our path to freedom. And I'm going to add dignity, opportunity, and mentorship. I love that.
There you go. Shout out to the sleuth. Okay. One last question. I promised it to the young lady in the front here. And so go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Sabrina. I'm with Braver Angels with the Europe chapter, or Europe Alliance.
Hey, Sabrina.
I was going to ask a very specific economic question about apprenticeships. However, if I have to beat his question, I think I'll just think about why I came here and part of something that I'm looking forward to sort of bringing back in my work circles or in the circles of the Europeans in which I'm networking with for Braver Angels. I want to be able to tell them something positive that goes against sort of the narratives that a lot of European news sources that I read say about our country. So sort of from this panel, what's something that you both can really strongly summarize that you feel is hopeful, like tangibly hopeful about the progress that we can make for African Americans in this country?
Tavis, Ian?
Okay.
Wow. Does that mean you don't have something optimistic to say?
That's also fine, but...
I'll go first.
Let me just say really quick, don't let the Swiss get a better one on us on this. Don't let them be right about this. That's what I'll say.
It's a great question. And let me answer it this way. I make a clear distinction, and I want to use the word that you used. I make a clear distinction between optimism and hope. They're not the same thing. Fundamentally different. Optimism suggests there's a particular set of facts, circumstances, or conditions, something you can see, feel, or touch that gives you reason to believe that things are going to get better. That's optimism. And frankly, that ain't where I live. And frankly, that's not where Black folk have ever lived. And that's why the brother in the MC's right. You can't dismiss this. You can't ignore it. It's as real as rain. Black people have never, as you mentioned African Americans, Black people have never in the history of this country had reason to be optimistic, ever. There were never facts, circumstances, or conditions. There were never things we could see, feel, or touch that gave us reason to believe that things were going to get better. Can I convince you of this right quick? Harriet Tubman didn't go back 19 times because she was optimistic. Mary McLeod Bethune didn't do what she did in the realm of education with Eleanor Roosevelt because she was optimistic. Rosa Parks didn't sit down on that bus because she was optimistic. Black folk have never had reason in this country, even right now, to be optimistic about our future. What we do have is hope. And I'm an example, and many other black folk I know, most black folk I know who ever succeeded are examples that you can build an entire life out of hope. Not to proselytize, but the Bible that I read says that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And so we have always been a hopeful people, not an optimistic people. So the message I would send back to Brave Angels in New York is that we have to remain hopeful. Now, hope needs some help. Hope needs help, but we have to remain hopeful. Again, even when the data doesn't suggest that things are going to get better for us, we have to remain hopeful. I take the point that Ian made earlier, which obviously he has the last word.
Although the lunch bell's just about to ring.
Yeah. I don't want people to ever be hopeless, but we can build lives on hope. We're not in a moment right now. We are not in a moment in Black America, and frankly, I don't think we're at a moment in American history right now where we have necessarily reason to be optimistic. But at our best, we are people who are hopeful, and we can build something on that platform of hope, and that's where I am. Thank you for listening to me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And I know. Unfortunately, I am duty bound to let us out for lunch here. Ian, I believe that you do have reason for hope and optimism. I suspect, just knowing yourself and a bit of how you see things.
Well, I run school, so that I'm guilty of hope and optimism. There's a poem that all of our kids at Vertex are going to learn. It's Invictus by William Ernest Henley. And if you're looking for some inspiration, read that poem, because William Ernest Henley was going through an incredible challenge in his own life when he wrote that poem. But the last two lines of that poem that all of our students are going to know, they're going to know the entire poem, but they are, I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And the reason we have that, and that will be our standard bearer, is there are no victims in our school. They're only architects of their own lives. And that's the kind of student that we're trying to build, even in the face of historical and present day challenges.
Indeed. So, ladies and gentlemen of Braver Angels, whether or not you are optimistic, let us make these next few days a testament to the power of hope.
Thank you for listening to Uniting America. If you'd like to support the show, you can do it by subscribing on YouTube and on your favorite podcast platform and leaving us a positive rating, review, or suggestions. Follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and tune in for more content. And learn more about the movement to depolarize America at braverangels.org.